Good afternoon, everyone. Can I first of all remind members that social distancing measures are in place in the chamber, which I think is fine at the moment, and all across the Holyrood campus. I would ask that members take particular care to observe the measures, including when entering and exiting the chamber. And the next item of business is a statement by the Lord Advocate, James Wolfe, on COVID-19 update by the Lord Advocate. The Lord Advocate will take questions at the end of his statement, so there should be no interventions or interruptions. Lord Advocate, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. As Lord Advocate, I am constitutionally responsible for the investigation of sudden, unexpected and unexplained deaths in Scotland. Whilst that is a function which I exercise independently of any other person, I want to take this opportunity to advise Parliament of the approach which I am taking to that responsibility in relation to deaths attributable to COVID-19. At the outset of the pandemic, I issued a direction that COVID-19 or presumed COVID-19 deaths do not require to be reported to the Crown unless there is some other substantive reason for reporting the death. That direction was consistent with the approach which has been taken in relation to other significant outbreaks of infectious disease. It is an approach which helps to reduce the demands on the medical profession whilst maintaining the overall integrity of the system for reporting and investigating deaths. In terms of that system, a death falls to be reported to the Crown if the circumstances of the death are such as to give rise to public anxiety. My officials have been keeping the situation under review, and I've concluded that two categories of COVID-19 or presumed COVID-19 deaths meet this criterion and should accordingly be reported to the Crown. Those categories are, firstly, all COVID-19 or presumed COVID-19 deaths where the deceased may have contracted the virus in the course of their employment or occupation. Whilst not exhaustive, this may include deaths of care home workers, frontline NHS staff, public transport employees, and emergency services personnel. And secondly, all COVID-19 or presumed COVID-19 deaths where the deceased was resident in a care home when the virus was contracted. My officials have been working closely with the Office of the Chief Medical Officer and with others on the practical arrangements to put those principles into implementation. And once that work is concluded, a letter will be issued from the Office of the CMO and from Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service to medical practitioners, advising them that from the date of that letter they should report any death falling within either of these two categories to the Crown. My decision also applies to deaths within these two categories which have already occurred, but arrangements are being made so that the Crown can obtain the information which it requires in order to identify and register those deaths without imposing any burden of retrospective reporting on medical practitioners. These steps will ensure that all deaths within the two categories which I have described will be registered within the Crown system of death investigation, and each of these deaths can be investigated. The nature and extent of that investigation, the nature and the extent of the investigation which is required in relation to any particular death or group of deaths will depend on the particular circumstances. In some cases, the investigation required may be quite limited. In other cases, it may be more extensive, and that will depend on the particular circumstances. In that regard, it would be premature for me to speculate at this stage whether a fatal accident inquiry into any particular death or categories of death from COVID-19 would or would not be appropriate. Those are decisions which will fall to be made on the basis of the circumstances of each particular case once it has been investigated. In discharging my responsibilities for the investigation of deaths, I am acutely conscious of the interests of bereaved relatives facing sudden loss. The Crown will be sensitive to the needs of bereaved relatives and will keep them informed about any investigation in accordance with the Family Liaison Charter which I laid before Parliament in 2016. And the Crown will take a multi-agency approach, working with other agencies which have relevant responsibilities, with the Health and Safety Executive, with local authorities, with the Care Inspectorate, with the police and others, to ensure, firstly, that the right investigations are undertaken by the right agency or agencies in each case, and secondly, that the right decisions can be made by the Crown in fulfilment of its independent responsibilities about whether further investigation or any further process of inquiry is required in each particular case. The approach which I have outlined about the reporting of deaths is the first stage in enabling those steps to be taken. For my part, I am confident that these arrangements will help to make sure that in due course we will, as a society, better understand the circumstances of these deaths. And where there are lessons that we can, as a society, learn for the future, we will learn those lessons. Knowing as we do that every one of these deaths is an individual tragedy, which calls for, from each one of us, profound sorrow, compassion, and respect. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Advocate. And the Lord Advocate will now take questions on the issues raised in his statement. I can only allow around 10 minutes for questions, so it would be helpful for those members who wish to ask a question to press the request to speak buttons. I'm pleased that we have 2 members joining us remotely today to ask questions. And to avoid any potential hold-ups, can I just note that John Finney will be called after the 2 front bench speakers. So first of all, can I have Liam Kerr, please?
Well, thank you, Presiding Officer. I thank the Lord Advocate for advance sight of his statement. And I welcome, on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives, the investigation of deaths in care homes and those of key workers. They are on the front line, and we must ensure their families get the answers they deserve. Lord Advocate, I have 3 questions today, if I may. What steps will be taken on quality assurance to ensure that every single death in these categories is reported to the Crown? Secondly, who in the health service will take overall responsibility for accurate reporting? And finally, because we know unacceptable delays are not unheard of at the Crown Office, can I ask how long families can expect to wait after the deaths of their loved ones for these investigations to conclude?
Lord Advocate.
Yes. I'm grateful to Liam Kerr for his endorsement of the principles that I've outlined. In relation to the process of reporting, there are well-established processes for the reporting of sudden, unexpected and unexplained deaths. These are well understood across the medical profession. The Crown Office, the letter that I mentioned in my statement, will issue guidance to medical practitioners about the principles to be applied, and the Crown Office is establishing a dedicated unit to undertake this work with a view to making the process as smooth as it can be. In relation to deaths which have already occurred, my officials have been working closely with the other agencies who have an interest and to whom deaths in these various contexts are reported, Health and Safety Executive, the Care Inspectorate and local authorities and others. I'm confident that in relation to those deaths, the Crown will be able to obtain the information that it requires without imposing a burden on the medical profession. In terms of the length of investigations, as I said in the course of my statement, I'm acutely conscious of the impact of, first of all, a sudden death and then the process of investigation on bereaved relatives. The Crown Office is establishing a dedicated unit in order to undertake this work. Every investigation will, of course, be different and will take a different amount of time before it can be concluded. I can't, therefore, give a commitment on the precise length of time that any investigation will take. However, I can say that in non-pandemic cases, the great majority of death investigations are concluded in a very short time and the case able to be closed with answers provided to the families. And I don't expect that situation to be different in the context of the pandemic deaths. There will be deaths that require a more extensive investigation, but it's anticipated that most death investigations will be able to be concluded relatively quickly.
Call James Kelly.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. No one should lose their life as a result of going into the workplace. And it's particularly tragic that NHS workers, those in the care sector and other public service workers have lost their lives to COVID-19 in trying to protect others. Does the Lord Advocate therefore accept that as a matter of public interest, those who have lost their lives in the NHS and in care homes and other public service roles that should be considered as a matter of priority for a fatal accident inquiry, and what avenues will be open to relatives and workplace trade union representatives to make their views known in order to make representations for a fatal accident inquiry.
The Lord Advocate.
I'm grateful to James Kelly for that question, and he's absolutely right in to express the tragedy which each one of these deaths is. As he knows, the system investigation of death in Scotland includes but does not require a fatal accident inquiry in every death that is reported to the Crown. And in most cases, the Crown's investigation establishes the cause and circumstances of the death. It would not be appropriate for me at this stage to speculate before investigations have been carried out about what those investigations may lead to, or about the circumstances in which a fatal accident inquiry will be held. But where the law requires a fatal accident inquiry, one will be held. And where the Crown conclude following investigation that a fatal accident inquiry should in the public interest be held, then one will be instructed. In relation to his point about the opportunity for relatives and others to make their views known, the Family Liaison Charter that I laid before Parliament in 2016 committed the Crown to listening to and taking the views of relatives on the question of whether a fatal accident inquiry should be held, and also to, if a decision in any individual case is made not to hold a fatal accident inquiry, to be prepared to review that decision should the next of kin wish such a review to be undertaken.
We move to the open questions, and may I have John Finney to be followed by Rhoda Mackay. Excuse me. Mr. Finney.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you, Lord Advocate, for early sight of your statement and for the content of it. Lord Advocate, you'll be aware that in relation to the multi-agency approach that the Inspectorate of Prosecutions recommended in the report that there be memoranda of understanding with all investigative agencies. Can you perhaps give us an update on that? And have you had discussions with these other agencies, I think particularly the Health and Safety Executive, and an assurance of their full cooperation of this change of approach, please?
Lord Advocate.
Yes, focusing specifically on the issues that I've addressed in my statement, my officials have been engaging very closely with Health and Safety Executive, with the Care Inspectorate, with the police and other agencies, including, as I mentioned, the Office of the Chief Medical Officer, the Death Certification Review Service. There are a number of bodies which have an interest in and particular responsibilities in this area. The Crown's approach in this context is very much to see it as a multi-agency exercise in which the Crown plays a key role, given its independent responsibility for the investigation of each death. I'm confident on the information I've been given that there will be good cooperation and strong working in partnership with the key agencies.
Call Rhoda Mackay to be followed by Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This is clearly a very distressing time for families who have sadly lost loved ones. Can the Lord Advocate provide further details regarding the impact these changes will have on bereaved families, and whether he anticipates, for example, that there will be a delay for relatives in arranging a funeral as a result of the changes announced today?
The Lord Advocate.
Yes, I am, and I may say the professional and experienced staff in the Scottish Fatalities Investigation Unit who undertake this work on my behalf are acutely conscious of the impact of a sudden death and of a subsequent investigation for bereaved families. I've set out the Crown's commitment to bereaved families in the Charter, which I've already mentioned. But perhaps there are 2 points that I should make here. As I've already observed, in the majority of cases, the great majority of cases, the Crown does not anticipate the steps which I've announced will delay the ability of families to make funeral arrangements. And in the small number of cases where there is a delay, it will be kept to the absolute minimum. The second point which I should make is that while every investigation is different, most investigations, as I observed to Liam Kerr, in a non-pandemic context, are capable of being closed within a relatively short period, and I do not anticipate the position to be materially different in the present context. But where a more substantial and lengthy investigation is required, the Crown will keep the family informed and take into account the family's views in accordance with the Family Liaison Charter.
Call Liam MacArthur.
Thanks, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I too thank the Lord Advocate for early sight of the statement and welcome much of the substance within it. The processes outlined will of course be alien to the vast majority of people. So can the Lord Advocate perhaps set out in a little more detail what families should expect by way of updates? Will there be a straightforward process for seeking information if they have questions? And is he confident that the Crown Office has the capacity to deal with the additional inquiries that will inevitably result from this process?
The Lord Advocate.
Yes, the Charter which I've mentioned gives clear commitments to early engagement with families, to keeping families informed on a regular basis, to taking their views into account, and those processes will be followed. The Crown Office, as I mentioned, is establishing a dedicated unit to undertake this work. I am mindful, and the service is mindful of its importance in the current context, and in the current context of the need to keep the interests of bereaved families in the forefront of our minds. The resourcing of the unit will be kept under review as events unfold, and the service is already making arrangements to ensure that it's staffed to deal with the cases that are anticipated.
That concludes questions on the Lord Advocate's statement. Point of order, Mr Finlay.
Apologies for rising to make a point of order, Presiding Officer. These are hugely important issues that the Lord Advocate is here to discuss. I know the parliamentary timetable is not for you to determine, but for members to have 10 minutes on such a hugely important issue, I feel is completely unacceptable, and it just has to be on the record.
All I would say to Mr Finlay is he quite rightly pointed out that's not a matter for me to decide on parliamentary business. It's a matter for the Business Bureau. And all I can suggest is that Mr Finlay raises that with his group's own representative on the Business Bureau. Can I say apologies to those that I wasn't able to call for questions? That would be Fulton McGregor, Shona Robinson and indeed Mr Finlay himself. And we'll now move on to the next item of business.